Last time we spoke about the first encirclement campaign against the CCP. Amidst ongoing attacks, the communist movement thrived in rural Jiangxi, even as urban support dwindled. Li Lisan championed urban uprisings, opposing Mao Zedong's focus on rural encirclement. Failed assaults on Nanchang and Changsha highlighted their discord. The Red Army strategy shifted after capturing Jian, bolstered by peasant support. As the NRA prepared an encirclement, Mao Zedong proposed luring them deep before striking. Internal strife peaked with the Futian incident, leading to a purge that solidified Mao Zedong's power but weakened the Red Army's defenses. Amidst the internal strife, the NRA launched attacks on the Reds but faced fierce resistance. Liu Duping's forces entered Donggu, leading to heavy losses as artillery mistakenly struck their own troops. The Reds capitalized on local support and guerrilla tactics, inflicting significant defeats on the NRA in Longgang and Dongshao. Despite Chiang Kai-shek's attempts to reclaim territory, the Reds successfully executed a series of ambushes and strategic retreats. But by the end of the campaign, the Jiangxi Soviet expanded significantly, validating Mao Zedong's strategies and shifting public favor towards the communists. This episode is the Sino-Tibet War of 1930 to 1932. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we start, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube and all major podcast platforms. And I have a huge favor to ask. I just released a brand new episode covering the Battle of Rehe, that being the Japanese invasion of North China in 1933. It's the first episode where I have footage from my brand new animator. In order to pay that said animator, I'm using funds from my YouTube membership and my Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. I'm hoping by using both, I'll secure enough funding to have the animator on full time to improve my craft. So over on both my YouTube membership and my Patreon account, I've been pumping out the exclusive podcast series. I think there's over maybe 3 months of early access content at this point, and of course there will be voting rights for all the subjects I'll tackle next. With more than, I think, about 25 plus exclusive podcasts at this point, I really think it is a deal. So please, if you have a chance, give it a look. For those of you who know their Sino history, we are drawing closer to the year of 1931. This is arguably the year World War II actually began, and some of you might be confused by that statement, but I assure you, for mainland Chinese, they would argue this point very much. Once we breach that door, it's going to be a very long time before we can talk about multiple other things going on in China. For example, a lot happens in China's northwest. So I thought it would be best to try and tackle some of those things before we jump into what is the 15-year China War. And do forgive me for being a bit of a tease. So the first thing I wanted to talk to you about is the Second Sino-Tibetan War of 1930-1932. Now this is a huge can of worms, as they say. To truly understand it, we need to cover a little bit of back history. Now, there has always been conflict between whatever we consider historically China and Tibet. Historians have often broken things down into 3 major conflicts during the early 20th century that led directly to the Second Sino-Tibetan War. After the outbreak of the Shanghai Revolution, the 13th Dalai Lama closely monitored the political changes in mainland China and the situation of central government's officials and military stationed in Tibet, preparing to organize Tibetan forces to initiate an anti-Han incident movement. In March of 1912, the Dalai Lama issued a public letter through the Ganden Palace via Kashang. The Kashang was the governing council of Tibet during the rule of the Qing dynasty, all the way up to the 1950s actually. Following the release of the letter, the 13th Dalai Lama immediately formed a Tibetan People's Army of over 10,000 troops, deciding to use force to expel the Sichuanese army. The Tibetan forces first dealt with the Sichuan troops stationed in Yadong, Jiangxi, and Shugatsi, and then they besieged the Sichuan troops in Lhasa. Fearing being attacked from both within and outside, the Tibetan forces hastened to eliminate the Sichuan troops already within Tibet. The local Tibetan authorities also initiated an offensive against the region known as the Kham, in the west of Sichuan. After 1939, this place would be called Xikang, so to make things easier, I will refer to it as such. The extensive eastward expansion on behalf of the Tibetan army shocked the entire nation, prompting military and political figures from Sichuan, Yunnan, and other areas to issue telegrams or contact the central government, demanding military action to quell the unrest and stabilize Tibet. In response to the chaotic situation in Tibet and Xikang, the Yuan Shikai government adopted a strategy of sending troops to suppress it. On May the 25th of 1912, Yuan Shikai issued an order for a westward expedition, and on June the 14th, the Beiyang government directed Governor of Sichuan, Yin Changheng, to lead the troops westward. On July the 10th, Yin Changheng led 2,500 Sichuan troops westward from Chengdu. At the same time, Taihe dispatched Yunnanese troops northwards to meet the Sichuan army in Tibet. In August, the Sichuan army split into two routes. The southern route, led by Zhu Xuanlin, attacked Hukao, modern-day Yajiang and Litang, defeating the Tibetan troops and capturing the key strongholds of Maguizhong, Jiangzhubei, and Chulolo, subsequently laying siege to Litang. The northern route was led by Lao Rulin, who provided assistance to Chengdu and Batang. Meanwhile, the Yunnanese troops entered Tibet via the Nu River, capturing the gateway of Yanjing in northern Yunnan. At the end of August, Lu Rulin attacked the eastern Tibetan strongholds of Chengdu. On September the 3rd, Zhu Sanlin's forces captured Litang and recaptured Gongju, Sanyan, and Tongbu. Shortly thereafter, the areas of Jianhua, Baiyu, Daocheng, Xiangcheng, and Jiaya also surrendered. On September the 16th, the Western Expeditionary Army advanced westwards from Chengdu, attacking Jiangda. By the end of September, the Western Expeditionary Army had recovered all territories belonging to the late Qing dynasty's Sichuan-Yunnan Border Affairs Department, except for the counties of Kima and Chayu in the southern route, and Dingqing represented by roughly 39 clans, Shaobaodo, Lari, and Jiangda in the northern route. On September the 12th, the Beijing government ordered the change of Jiangda in Tibet to Taizhou Prefecture, Lari to Jiali Prefecture, and Shaobaodo to Shangzhou Prefecture. On the 25th, Yin Changheng was appointed as the pacification envoy at the Sichuan border, overseeing the Xikang region, which was divided into the eastern and western border areas, governing the 6 prefectures of Kangding, Yihua, Ba'an, Donghe, Chengdu, and Jiahe, as well as 2 states of Duha and Ganji. Just as the Western Expeditionary Army was achieving victory and preparing to enter Tibet from Kanding, the British colonial authorities publicly intervened, trying to prevent the Expeditionary Army from entering Tibet. Under British pressure, Yuan Shikai was forced to order the Sichuan and Yunnanese armies to delay their advance, effectively halting their progress at the Nu River line. At the same time, the Beiyang government's policy towards Tibet shifted from suppression to pacification. Although the Sichuanese and Yunnanese armies ceased their military actions against Tibet, the significance of the Western expedition was quite profound, as it enabled the central government to basically recover Xikang and played a significant role in curbing the British colonizers and the Tibetan separatist forces, preventing Tibet from repeating the fate of Outer Mongolia. Thus ended the first period of conflict. What preceded was known as the Samla Convention. We actually covered this event in some detail a long time ago in the series. More or less, the convention divided Tibet into Outer and Inner Tibet, which also were referred to as Yuezhang and Western Kham, i.e. Xikang. With the support and assistance of Britain, the Tibet local government gathered troops in eastern Tibet to confront the Sichuan army, aiming to use military force to advance the control of the area of the Tibetan government to Dajianlu. In September of 1917, 2 Tibetan soldiers from the Loka area invaded the Sichuan army's defensive zone, and they were captured and sent to Chengdu by the border troops. After questioning by Commander Peng Rusheng, it was clear that the captured Tibetans would have to be detained. Tibet then sent a letter to negotiate, requesting the return of the captured Tibetans, that should be handled by Tibetan officials. Peng Rusheng, without assessing the situation, executed the captured individuals and sent their heads back. which obviously infuriated the Tibetans, leading them to mobilize a large force to attack and Loka. The British immediately supplied the Tibetan army with 5,000 quick-firing rifles and 5 million rounds of ammunition to support a large-scale offensive against Enda County and Loka. By January of 1918, Enda County had fallen. The counties of Chaya, Ningjing, and Chengdu were all under attack by the well-armed Tibetan army. In March, Ningjing County was lost, and Chengdu's garrison were, quote, surrounded on all sides, though there was plenty of food in the city, but they had run out of ammunition. In June, the Tibetan army captured Chengdu, and after accepting Peng Rishing's surrender, they advanced rapidly eastwards across the Ningqing Mountains and the Jincha River, capturing the counties of Dege, Dongke, Shiku, Baiyu, Gangxiang, Wuchang, and Ningqing, until they were stopped by fierce fighting from the border troops at Ganzi. On August the 8th of 1918, the Dalai Lama expressed his unwillingness to oppose what he called the Chinese benefactor, but agreed to a ceasefire. On August 21st, a ceasefire agreement consisting of 13 articles was reached in Chengdu among Liu Zhangting, a representative of the Sichuan border troops, Zhang Baidan, a representative of the Tibetan side, and a representative of the British government. They all agreed that the Tibetan army would withdraw from the recently occupied counties of Jianhua and Ganzi and return them to the Sichuan border, while remaining occupied counties would be managed by Tibetan officials. They also agreed to a ceasefire for 1 year starting from October the 17th of 1918, awaiting a resolution to the Tibetan issue from the central government and the Dalai Lama. This 13-article agreement effectively recognized the Tibetan army's occupation of the border areas in legal terms. After this, Chengdu and the aforementioned 7 counties west of the Jincha River came under the control of the Tibetan local government. Thus ended the second period of conflict. Then here comes the year of 1930. Now, a lot had occurred during the 1920s. The Ban government had tried to maintain the indirect administrative structures of the former Qing dynasty. In the absence of effective Chinese political control over Tibet, implementation of national policy fell onto regional actors. In this case, Fu Xiaoyi in Suyuan and Liu Huanhui in Xikang. Along the Qinghai-Amdo frontier, Sino-Muslim leaders like Ma Bufang projected military authority from the provincial capital of Xining. Now, a lot of what we're about to talk about revolves around a place called Yushu. Yushu is a mountainous region of the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau. The Tangala Mountains from the southwestern boundary of Yushu, bordering Tibet. In the largely inhabitable northwestern region of Yushu, you'll find the renowned Keke-Shili Nature Reserve and the railway connecting Xining to Lhasa. The main branch of the Kunlun Mountains, which splits Qinghai province into northern and southern regions, forms Yushu's northern boundary, with a branch of the Kunlun Range, the Bainar Mountains, defining its northeastern edge. Yushu is a source of 3 of Asia's major rivers. The northeasternmost section of the Yushu drains into the Yellow River as it flows towards Lanzhou, the capital of Gansu. Central and southeastern Yushu gives rise to the headwaters of the Mukong and Yangtze, known locally as the Jiaoku and Tongqian rivers. The Qinghai provincial government emphasized the region's prominent topographical features, mountain ranges, and river systems. Provincial reports meticulously describe the mountain passes that link Yushu to key areas such as Lhasa, Chengdu, and Xikang, Sichuan, Xinjiang, and Xining, along with the challenging passes within Yushu. Yushu is very difficult terrain for communication and transportation, quite the obstacle for any form of governance. The journey between the provincial capital and Yushu totaled over 1,620 li. A highway connecting such a path would only be built in 1944. A strong local governance was found in the form of Tibetan tribes known as the 25 Peoples of Yushu. Yet the Qinghai provincial government sought to govern the land, and those in Xining viewed Yushu as a barbarian region where pastoral nomadism reigned. They would speak of Yushu as being an endless steppe inhabited by barbaric people who just wandered around aimlessly. Yushu had a complicated economic geography, with monasteries occupying the richest land and concentrating monetary, spiritual, and political power on the local scale, and pastoral tribes migrating in the areas between. The monasteries acted as sites for periodic markets of trade throughout Yushu. As much as they were Tibetan Buddhist monasteries for religious devotion, they were also landowners with power and taxation. The hereditary tribal leaders of the 25 peoples of Yushu were thus a secondary network of political and economic authority in Yushu. The pastoral tribes who traversed the borderless regions of Yushu, Xikang, and Kam confused all outsiders. To put things simply, it's such a confusing mess that everybody from the outside just had no idea what was actually going on. As I read an entire book on the subject, what I gathered was that officials in the surrounding provinces who thought that they had authority over Yushu had no idea what was actually going on in Yushu, and thus it was easy for conflicts to emerge. The Beian government, as I have said, tried to simply adopt the former Qing policies. For Yushu, they were ruling through an indirect system of local headmen. Each tribe determined their title, either company commander or battalion commander, and they were responsible for biannual taxes and periodic military conscription to the government in Xining. One of these tribal leaders, Tai Zhoujian, the leader of the Buqing tribe, came from Hongyuan, lying between Xining and the Ruyue Mountains. His father worked as a translator for the Xining tribute tax collection missions. The 1920s were continuous years of strife, especially between the tribes. No governing body readily understood or had any real control over the region. In 1929, Yushu became an official county. On August 6th of that year, Ma Qi advocated an 8-point plan for calming her border problems. The plan included reconstructing a civilian government, promoting Tibetan Buddhism, opening more land for agriculture, training troops, establishing factories and mills, improving transportation, and securing borders. He sought to implement all of this through the Yushu County government. However, in the same year, the Civil Affairs Bureau recommended adding 7 new counties, some of which would carve chunks out of Yushu. The plan never materialized due to the ongoing government difficulties, but remained on the table. In the meantime, the government began a provincial-level training program for self-government regions within Shanghai. 50 graduates came out of this program, and not a single one came or were sent to Yushu. They had no idea what was going on there. By the late 1920s, the region was being fought over by multiple parties for multiple reasons. There were 3 overarching reasons for why war would break out. Number 1 was because of the border disputes between Tibet and China. The Tibetans claimed areas inhabited by their people in the neighboring provinces of Shanghai and Sichuan. They were also arguing those were being ruled by warlords with loose connections to the Nanjing government, which absolutely was true. Number 2, there was a dispute between the 13th Dalai Lama and the Ninth Panchen Lama. To clarify, because I also was not aware of what this was, the Panchen Lama is the second to the Dalai Lama. To be more specific, the Panchen Lama is the reincarnation of Amitabha, the Buddha of boundless light, while the Dalai Lama is a reincarnation of Avalokiteshvara, Chonrenzing in Tibetan, who is the Buddha of compassion. Traditionally, each acts as a mentor to the other, and plays a key role in identifying the other's reincarnation. To be blunt, the Ninth Panchen Lama had bad blood with the 13th Dalai Lama, and he had been exiled, and he was seen to be quite pro-Chinese afterwards, because he was, to be honest, he was just butthurt, yeah. And number 3 was the complex disputes of all of the various peoples within the regions like Yushu. Now, the catalyst for the war was a chieftain from the town of Beri, which is in Yushu, but is also an area claimed by Tibet, and under control of Sichuan. So yeah, as you can see, this is pretty confusing. This chieftain, whose name I cannot for the life of me find, seized items from the Tagyu Monastery. It is alleged the Ninth Panchen Lama incited this action. The monks of the monastery rallied forces and took back the properties. The chieftain then asked for help from the governor of Sichuan, Liu Wenhui. Liu Wenhui unleashed forces into the area, forcing the Tagyu monks to ask for help from the Tibetan government, who drove his men out. And obviously thus began a series of clashes. The KMT Muslim official, Tang Qisan, was dispatched to negotiate an end to the conflict. Muslim general Ma Fuxiang was appointed head of the Mongolian and Tibetan Affairs Commission, and he sent a telegram instructing Tang Qisan to break the agreement with Tibet, fearing political rivals in Nanjing were exploiting the situation. In the following years, Tibetan forces launched repeated attacks on Liu Wenhui's troops, but they were defeated multiple times. In 1932, the Tibetans rallied 6,000 troops along the Jinsha River, an area that acted as a boundary between Yushu and Xikang. In response to the Tibetan threat, in March, the government established the Shanghai southern border region, garrisons under Ma Bufang. 2 brigades deployed in Yushu. The first brigade was led by Mao Shun, and the second by Mao Biao. The Tibetans invaded, but only Mao Biao's men were ready at the border area, as Mao Shun's were still en route from the provincial capital. At the time of the attack, Mao Biao had 1 camp of cavalry, alongside some headquarters personnel for a combined total of just 400 men. He dispatched his secretary, Wang Jiamei, to Tibet to try and negotiate a peaceful settlement. It is believed he did this simply to delay the enemy, as he immediately telegrammed Ma Bufang for reinforcements, but they would not arrive until mid-June. On March 24th, the Tibetans attacked Lesser-sur-Marne, gradually forcing their way into southern Shanghai. After 8 hours of battle, both sides suffered tremendous casualties. And during that night, within the county seat of Jiegu, Ma Biao convened a conference attended by chieftains, merchants, and important town leaders. At the meeting, Ma Biao asserted, "Our strength is sufficient to protect the lives and the property of Yushu's residents. Not only will we resist Tibetan incursions, but in the future we will tie our war horses at the gate of the Tibetan government's compound." However, Ma Biao would find it quite difficult to make do on these promises. March 26th, the Greater Surman contingent of his forces met 500 Tibetans on the battlefield just southeast of Jiegu. As told to us by Tai Zhoujian, "The Tibetans simply overwhelmed the undermanned provincial forces by at least 5 to 1. They retreated to a camp near Duolangduo, where they quickly became surrounded by Tibetan forces. At the same time, a detachment of other provincial forces at Lesser-sur-Marne, only 30 men, who were encircled by 100 Tibetans quite quickly. The provincial forces continuously retreated in the face of an enemy 5 to 10 times larger than them. The Tibetans methodically seized territory heading north to encircle the county seat of Jiegu. At the same time, a contingent of 300 troops from Xikang forded the Tongtan River to attack the monasteries at Leibu and Chuwu, situated on the 2 vital thoroughfares heading north to Jiegu. The Tibetans held a strong military position, and in one incredible move swept and occupied all the areas surrounding Jigu's southern portion, severing the county seat's communication with Xining. Jigu was the site of Yushu's county government and nominally held the headquarters of the southern Shanghai garrison. Thus, it was a key holding of Xinyang's position in the southern borderlands. Now outnumbered 10 to 1 by the Tibetans, and with their communications severed, the situation for Xining and the Shanghai forces was quite dire. It seemed likely that Tibetans would shut the door, locking Xining out. The southern Shanghai border region garrison, a mouthful to be sure, under Mao Biao, were digging in for a long-drawn-out defense of the Yushu county seat, while Xining went into a frenzy of actions. On April the 19th, Ma Lin and Mao Bufang telegrammed the Military Affairs Commission in Nanjing with strong recommendations for improving the situation. They wanted to move the southern Shanghai garrison roughly 20 li west of Jigu and station a regiment between Jigu and Xining at Dahuba to protect the lines of communication. They also requested 2,000 rifles, 20,000 rounds of ammunition, 40,000 yuan, and 5 wireless telegraphs. While all of that sounds like just peanuts, do remember Japan is currently full-blown invading Manchuria. On the last day of April, Mao Bufang requested Ma Lin dispatch the southern Qing border region garrison's 1st Brigade, led by Commander Mao Shun, because everybody's a Mao in this episode, to the southern front as Yushu's pacification commissioner. He also again stated he wanted a peaceful settlement to the conflict. 4 days later, Mao Bufang and Ma Lin telegrammed Xi'an announcing Mao Shun's appointment as Yushu Suanweishu, the Yushu Pacification Commissioner. Yet it was not until May the 24th that Nanjing's response reached Xining via Xi'an. Within the communiqué, Chiang Kai-shek approved their suggestions and would meet the requests for military aid, although at a lower level than requested. Only 1 wireless telegraph was sent by Nanjing, but it dramatically improved the communication situation. On May the 26th, Mao Shun departed Xining for Yushu, with others stating, "Regardless of whether peace can be maintained, the communications route between the provincial capital and Jigu must be protected at all costs." Mao Shun departed with roughly a regiment of just 100 troops, some provincial officials with Mongolian and Tibetan language skills, and a surveyor. Meanwhile, Mao Bufang led another expeditionary force as far as Dahuba, the site of the proposed garrison between Xining and Jige. Mao Shun's Mongolian and Tibetan specialists had orders from Nanjing to visit Shanghai, to awe the barbarians into loyalty to the new government by offering them doctors, dentists, botanists, and anyone who could dazzle the backward superstitious locals, as they referred to them. For 2 months, Mao Biao and his men struggled to maintain Jige's defenses, till finally on June the 18th, Mao Shun's group arrived. He would soon be followed up by 2 waves of reinforcements on August the 20th and September the 20th. Despite efforts made by Tai Zhou and other small contingents of Qinghai troops, the Tibetans simply had overwhelming numbers. The Qinghai troops, however, inflicted much more casualties upon them whenever they fought. A battle broke out on June the 27th at the Changgu Monastery, 5 leagues south of the county seat, where Qinghai forces led by Mao Biao defeated a Tibetan force twice their size, and they also happened to be enjoying high ground advantage. The same forces also fought again near the Tongtan River, due north of Jige, where the Tibetans were forced to withdraw. It seemed that the Tibetans lacked adequate artillery, as was evident from their inability to take Jige. Many of the civilians within Jige noted the Tibetans fired over 40 cannon rounds into the city, but none of the rounds seemed to explode. On July the 23rd, Mao Bufang dispatched a regiment led by La Pingfu to Yushu. Despite the combined forces of Mao Biao and Mao Shun engaging the Tibetans 3 times, they still had not seen the full strength of the Tibetans. There was a great concern on the Chinese side that the Tibetans were trying to lure in as many as possible before overwhelming them with numbers. Mao Bufang also dispatched reinforcements led by Mao Lu to the southern borderlands. On August 20th, La Pingfu arrived at Jige, and he freed the city of the Tibetan encirclement. La Pingfu's troops were exhausted from the incredible 20-day march through pretty insane terrain. They quickly took up defensive positions to rest. This allowed the forces of Mao Biao and Mao Shun to depart south with 800 local militiamen to attack the Tibetans. They found the Tibetans in the dead of night. The Qinghai forces used Dao Dao Dui swords to hack them to pieces in hand-to-hand combat. The Tibetans dispersed but reorganized themselves the very next morning. The Qinghai forces took some high ground and met the counterattack, this time decisively defeating the Tibetans, who suffered tremendous casualties. After 4 months, the Jige encirclement seemed to finally be broken. Afterwards, the Qinghai forces formed 3 groups to advance south to retake lost territory. Mao Biao and Mao Shun led rout armies while La Pingfu followed behind them. Mao Bufang ordered a punitive mission against the local Tibetans, hoping they would simply withdraw from Yushu peacefully. He also ordered law and order to be brought back to the region. Military commanders were to gather local religious and political elites who could deal with the inevitable issues like refugee waves. To further push the Tibetans to pull out, orders were mandated that medical care be given to any wounded Tibetan soldiers with promises of funding for their return home to Tibet as POWs. Mao Bufang also issued communiques to all inhabitants of Yushu asking them to get their local leaders and militia to help expel the Tibetan soldiers, promising good rewards. Tai Zhoujian's reports differed greatly from Mao Bufang's orders. Tai Zhoujian received reports, for example, that Mao Biao's men routinely killed POWs, attacked Tibetan civilians, and robbed Tibetan merchants. Tai Zhoujian would go on the record to accuse Qinghai forces of burning entire villages, looting monasteries, raping women, and even nuns. During this time, folk songs emerged in Shanghai, talking about bitter lives under the oppression of Xining overlords, who conscripted soldiers, stole horses and property to feed themselves on human soup, while the common people ate husks and chaff. It was often sung, "The sun doesn't rise in the Ma family's Qinghai." As the Qinghai troops continued advancing south, they punished locals for helping Tibetans. One local headman in Nangtian, who had helped Tibetans, had 10,000 jin of tsampa, 20,000 jin of barley, 3,000 jin of yak butter, 200 heads of cattle, and 40 sheep commandeered by Mao Biao. Many headmen would be forced to give goods to Mao Shun, Mao Biao, and La Pingfu, such things as pelts, antlers, horses, and money. It was said Mao Biao took enough to be worth 2,000 silver dollars from the nomads of Laishu. During late August and early September, the Qinghai forces fought the Tibetans for the Surman region and the southeastern parts of Yushu. They unleashed artillery on their enemy, trapping 2,000 Tibetan soldiers into a very confined area. They encircled them and systematically annihilated them, massacring about 200. Little Surmang quickly came back under Xining's control as the Tibetans fled to Greater Surmang. On September 2nd, La Pingfu led 300 men to occupy the rear exit of Greater Surmang. Despite a valiant defense led by two of Tibet's best generals, they suffered a string of defeats and they were forced to relinquish Greater Surmang. Then the third wave of reinforcements arrived from Xining, Mao Lu's brigade, who came to Jige on September 20th. This effectively solidified the Shanghai position. Mao Lu, Mao Shun, Mao Bufang, and Mao Biao all met south of Jige at Batang, where they agreed they would set out for the Jingsha River, which was marking the border region between Yushu and Xikang. There they would decisively defeat the enemy upon the western shore of Shidangke. At the Jingke Monastery, facing the Dongke River, a major connecting point to Changzhou, was the Tibetan power base in the region. The monastery's defenses were very solid, 3 lines of over 5,000 troops. On October 15th, the Qinghai artillery began raining hell upon the monastery as the infantry encircled the area. The Qinghai forces split their approaches, attacking and moving while encircling. They were aided by Xikang troops, who were also bombarding the monastery from across the Jingsha River. The Tibetans could not withstand the joint attacks, and they gradually gave up their positions. The Qinghai and Xikang armies then connected across the river. Liu Wenhui led the Xikang forces, and he was communicating with Mao Bufang, who ordered his forces to accept orders from the Xikang army. Many historians believe Liu Wenhui had coordinated this joint military campaign against the Tibetans, taking advantage of the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. It seems Liu Wenhui thought it was an opportune time to, quote, solve the Tibetan problem once and for all. This would have been a hell of an escalation. Liu Wenhui sent word to Mao Bufang. He also notified Chiang Kai-shek of their joint operation. However, Chiang Kai-shek demanded they halt hostilities and try to negotiate with the Dalai Lama. Meanwhile, the Dalai Lama received reports of their string of defeats and the loss of territory east of the Jingsha River, so he agreed to begin negotiations. What came from this was the Qinghai-Tibetan Peace Treaty, which more or less just set everything back to the pre-war status quo. The Tibetans would never again pose a serious threat to Qinghai's domination of Yushu. Yushu's strategic passes would remain in Qinghai's control well into the founding of the People's Republic of China. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, Pacific War Channel, found over at YouTube and all major podcast platforms. My latest podcast is going to be on the Battle of Leipzig, so all of you Napoleon fans are in for a treat over there. Over on YouTube, I did a rather unorthodox thing, and I made an episode covering how to play Germany in the game Axis and Allies. It was honestly just an excuse for me to put in some humor and memes into an episode for once. If you'd like to further help support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account. They are identical. The Patreon found at www.patreon.com/PacificWarChannel, where you get access to the exclusive podcast, early access to all the content that I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Over there, I'm about to release an episode covering how the Century of Humiliation, the foundation of this very podcast, formed the People's Republic of China that we know today. And one last thing, if you'd like some rather more comical and funny episodes, I do recommend checking out my YouTube membership, where I have a bunch of content that I never released to the public, and for good reason. We'll say it's not politically correct stuff. It's worth a watch. It was a series called The Speakeasies, so give it a look. While it would appear as a major side quest in the greater scheme of things, the small war between the Tibetans and Sichuanese was just another example of how not unified China really was. Despite all the grand claims, the new Nanjing government was still overseeing quite a fractured nation, who were about to face the full might of the Empire of the Rising Sun.